Okay, so today's gonna be kind of interesting. It's what we'll call kind of a common scenario. What it is where somebody has a project and they decide to buy a second project. In effect, what they're trying to do is use the second project as a parts car to preserve the first project. There are pros and cons to that. If you're buying a second car for the sake of saving money on parts, it's a good idea theoretically when it comes to interior, engine, transmission, driveline, anything on the mechanics. But where it tends to not be that great of an idea is when you're buying it for the sheet metal. Case in point, oftentimes when we buy a parts car because we plan on cutting floors out of it or rockers or something like that, those things tend to be in somewhat disrepair as it is already. So when you go and cut those parts out, you're already cutting away usable material to apply that to your current project. So sometimes that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and especially if you're having somebody like us use that parts car for the sheet metal application. Because think about this, a replacement quarter of a floor, for example, cost on that's what, about 125 bucks, whereas if you factor in the labor and the prep time to cut out a piece of a floor from a donor car and then sandblast it, prime it, weld it in place, that replacement piece that you have on that donor car oftentimes is far more expensive than just buying a good replacement part from an aftermarket retailer. But again, if you buy a parts car because it has a complete interior or an engine and stuff like that, that is typically a money saving opportunity. It's when you're buying parts car for the sheet metal that rarely works out for you, unless of course you're doing the work yourself. But again, you can't possibly remove parts from a parts car, meaning the sheet metal, and install them on your car with better quality than it is if you were just to buy the parts themselves in the first place. And we'll expand on that a little bit later. But for now, I'm gonna make a phone call to a person that's waiting for us. He lives out in some of the prettiest country in the state, and so we're going to take a field trip out there and look at these two cars he has and conclude which one is going to be the best one to save. And this is kind of a follow-up on a video we did a long time ago. It's actually one of the biggest videos that we get a lot of questions about, and that's how to buy an Alpha. We used a 67 Spider for that example, but now we're going to try to do this again, but this time we're going to use a GTV for the example of how to buy an Alpha, the pros and cons and the do's and don'ts. So we'll make this phone call and then we'll go from there. We'll get on the field trip. Okay, no problem. Okay, so I'll be leaving here about 10 o'clock. Okay? Okay, we'll see you shortly. Okay, bye. Sounds like a pretty interesting road. One of the things, oftentimes it's asked, when is it best to start in on a project? Well, quite frankly, it's typically best to start in on some of these projects in the summertime. Wintertime, shops like ours get immensely busy. We get busy with, winter prep on race cars, and a lot of people, that's when they settle into the concept of starting in on their projects, because that's the time they think about it for whatever reason. So shops like ours, we get really busy in the winter. And with us in the middle of trying to make our move to the new location, tackling a new project is not exactly a bad thing, but it just puts a little more chaos in our daily life. Believe it or not, the original game plan was to try to save the cars on the top of the lift. Quickly after looking at both of them, it was easy to see that the top one would be far more expensive to preserve than the bottom one. So we changed our plans rather quickly. All right, what that first shot was that Sean was just showing you is there is a crack right here in the inner fender wall. This is not uncommon. In fact, you've probably seen a few videos by now of us talking about that. On the earlier cars, especially step nose cars, this wall, this channeling, is single walled steel on each side with just little right angle brackets on the inside holding everything together. By the time the 69s came around, this started being doubled up, beefed up walling space. So you see things like this when tires tend to become very grippy and wider and a lot of stress is put on the cross member. The single wall cannot handle it, so it fatigues, it just works itself back and forth and eventually it starts to crack. So we'll inevitably have to put our race brace kit on this to ensure that this doesn't blow out one day. But But the real subject matter that we're talking about today is how to buy a GTV and when to know when to walk away. I hate saying that because I would like to save every last one of them, but the reality is sometimes it's just not practical to save some of these. This isn't necessarily the case for this car, believe it or not. The gentleman who owns this owns a couple of them, so we have one for potential donor parts if necessary. But effectively, there are things that kind of give you an inclination as to what is feasible for your pocketbook, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. Alright, so what Sean's doing right now is he's changing out the sway bar mounts, which is not an uncommon process on any of your GTV, especially if you have one that has battery box damage. You have to assume that the battery box, which would normally sit right here, if it's rusted through, that the battery acids work their way all the way down this channel. Okay, when they go down this channel, it settles in the bottom of the sway bar mounts. Inevitably, moisture, rust, and everything else destroy this area. Okay, and I'll show you there's things you could do to note that. Now here's the old one, and you can see that it's quite rusty and it was well on its way out. It wouldn't have held a very strong sway bar had we just assumed that it was okay. This is the new one. You can now buy these. At one point in time we used to have to make these, so I'm really glad these are in production again. So once that's welded up, the next thing that's going to happen is we're going to put a weld-through primer bridging replacing the metal onto the new one, so once that weld happens it doesn't expose the metal for rusting properties. Then after that's done, just before it's completely sealed up, Sean's going to feed this into there. This is called the cavity wax wand. You're going to feed it all the way back. This is effectively going to go all the way back to the pedal box, and then he injects cavity wax through this wand. This wand rotates. You can inject cavity wax all throughout that channel. The principle behind it is that if wax is coated onto the steel, oxygen can't get to it. If oxygen can't get to the steel, it can't rust. There's other things you can kind of assume that are going to be problematic. If you're looking at any given GTV, especially the step nose, and this would have been right here, okay? If you see right where the lower section of the valance is coming in contact with the radiator support, if that area is rusted, you can count on the sway bar mounts being most likely compromised as well. This is extensive work. You can see the nose is off this. The nose is off this one anyway because it was in an accident, so we got a replacement nose. But the point is this can be very expensive if certain things are compromised. If you're looking at a car that's got significant front end damage, and let's say the hinge panel for the step nose, for example, is completely destroyed in this accident, but the rest of the car is great. There is a problem with your thought process right there. Hinge panels, which are basically what the hood is attached to, aren't available. So effectively, if you get a replacement nose, you're not solving anything until you have a replacement hinge panel, which means that has to either come from somebody who's holding on to a new old stock one, or the other choice you have is somebody has to sacrifice another car for you to get that. Hinge panels, because those who have them know the value of them, they tend to come at a very premium price, okay? This particular car, because this guy happened to have a donor car, we had an option for a hinge panel. The other thing you need to think about is if you have to replace the front clip, there's another big problem. Headlight rings, they're not cheap. Those have to be replaced. There's a lot of attachment to the skin of the nose of a step nose car that can become very expensive to make that process complete in the repair. So if you're looking to buy one, pay attention to the little things like that. Headlight rings, very expensive. The nose clip itself, exceptionally expensive. Cutting out cross members, or radiator supports in this case, labor intensive, not expensive, but by the time you factor in the labor, it becomes outrageously expensive. When you look at the sway bar mounts, lots of labor to go into doing that, very expensive to do. So it's one of those things, know what you're getting into if you're looking to buy one.
Alright, so I've gotten to the point in my fabrication work that it's time to encapsulate the metal and seal everything up before we put the front radiator support on there. We have this nice little rust fighter wax coating that we put in there. It has this wand on it, and if you notice, on one side is where it sprays out of. It fans around as you spray it, so you need to kind of twist the hose as you pull it out. And you just thread this guy on up into your cavity, pull the trigger, and just pull it on back out. Twirl it as you go, and that's going to encase all that metal in there and make sure it doesn't rust up on you now that everything's sealed up. Alright, so we got our tube threaded up into the cavity, and now we're ready to spray the wax. So let's go pull the trigger and get started here. Just make sure to twist the tube as you pull back out. You want to make sure to try not to get any kinks in your tubing as well. Something you're going to have to watch out for. Just getting right to the end here, you can see this white stuff dripping out. It's actually the cavity wax we sprayed up in there to protect everything. Alright, so I've gotten to the point in the fabrication work that it's time that we need to...
And take two.
Please hang up and try again.
Alright, so I've gotten to the point in the fabrication work that we're going to need to kind of enclose things and seal everything up before we go too far and start sealing our orifices to get our sealant into.
Seal up our orifices?